Good morning. It is great to see you on this bitterly cold day. I walked in this morning, I saw that microphone stand. I thought Angie Phillips was going to sing, and I thought, man, I've been waiting for this. But as it turns out, it was Annabeth. And if you walked in this morning, she was supposed to do that during Christmas, and she got sick and couldn't do it. So we thought, man, she's practiced up, so we can have Christmas in the middle of January. So if you know her mother and dad, Cody and Hannah, you know she got all the talent from her mother. So I said that because her dad was walking in right when I said that. So if you see her after the service, make sure you thank her. I've got a picture I want to show you. This morning I want to take you back to a story that you may vaguely remember. It comes from 8 centuries before the birth of Jesus, and you probably read it at some point in your high school career, if you can remember back that far. It's called the Odyssey, written by a Greek poet named Homer. That's him on the right, and the Odyssey is kind of considered to be his masterpiece. If you haven't read it in a while, it tells the story of a soldier named Odysseus and his men who, right after the conclusion of the Trojan War, set off on their journey home back to Ithaca where they live. But if you know the story, instead of sailing like in a straight line from where they were to where they wanted to get to, they're continually blown off course. So they're blown from this island to this island, and every time they go to a new place, they encounter a new problem, an unexpected problem. Early in their journey, they face a particularly dangerous obstacle when they unknowingly stop to resupply on what Homer called the island of the lotus eaters. Now, lotus is a type of flower, and the way Homer described it, anyone who ate of the fruit of the lotus flower never wanted to leave. They just wanted to stay there. And so in the story, Odysseus would send out these men to check for supplies, and they would never come back. And then he'd send out a second group of men to look for the first group of men, and they didn't come back either. And it just goes on like that until finally Odysseus decides he needs himself to go and look for his men. And when he does, he finds these now battle-hardened soldiers kicked back in the sun with their feet propped up, eating the fruit of the lotus flower, as if they're on like spring break instead of trying to get home. Here's the way he described it. Any crewman who ate the lotus, the honey-sweet fruit, lost all desire to send a message back, much less return. Their only wish to linger there with the lotus eaters, grazing on lotus, all memory of their journey home dissolved forever. And here are these guys. They've been gone now for 10 years, away from their wives and their kids and their extended family. And now that the war is over, rather than fighting and rowing against the wind to get home, they allow themselves to get comfortable in a place they were never supposed to be to begin with. It's at that point that Odysseus knows he has to take drastic measures or he's going to lose all of his men. So here's his first-hand account of how he responded. He said, I brought them back to the hollow ships, and with streaming tears, I forced them, hauled them under the rowing benches, lashed them fast, and shouted out commands to my other steady comrades. Quick, no time to lose, embark in the racing ships so none could eat the lotus and forget the voyage home. Now, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 1. We're in this series that we're calling Finding Favor, week 2, and we're talking about the idea that God is not only with us, which is what we celebrate at Christmas, but that He's also for us, meaning that rather than just being an interested observer of your life, God wants to be an active participant in your life. So here's the way we said it last week, and whenever we talk about God's favor, we're talking about the idea that God is actively working to accomplish His will in your life. He wants to accomplish His will in your life. In Ephesians 2, verse 10, the Apostle Paul said it like this, For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So just as a side note, the word that the NIV translates as handiwork is the Greek word from which we get our English word poem. So just like just like the Odyssey is considered to be the masterpiece of Homer, there is a sense in which you are God's masterpiece. Or another way to think about it is that just like a poet writes a poem to deliver a specific message to the reader, you have been created by God to deliver a specific message to the world around you. The challenge, though, that all of us fight against is that just like the soldiers that Homer wrote about in the Odyssey, many of us have gotten comfortable living in a place that's not really our home. And instead of seeking God's will for our lives, we've instead given our will for our lives the priority. And so rather than like rowing against the wind to become the people that God created us to be and to do the things that God created us to do, we almost instinctively look for places that we can kick back, relax, just sort of hang out, and feed ourselves on the toxin of the lotus flowers that surround us. And the problem with that is if you stay in that place long enough, eventually, just like Homer described, you lose all desire to get better. In our culture, we call it settling. You've heard that phrase before. Whenever you talk about somebody who settles, it's usually a negative thing. You're talking about a person who even though they know things could be better, have pretty much resigned themselves to the fact that it's never going to get any better. And you know how it goes. So I know this relationship is toxic. Like I know this is not good for me, but it's better than being alone, so I'm just going to hang in there. Or I know I hate my job, and my boss is an idiot, and I dread going to work, and I don't feel like I'm accomplishing anything, but, I got bills to pay, and changing jobs is such a risk. Who knows? I know my health is bad. I know I'm terribly out of shape. I know I should do something about it, but there is this new series on Netflix, and when I get through with that, then maybe I'll start working out. I know my finances are a train wreck, but inflation and interest rates, cost of living, what can you do? And the answer is that most people don't do anything. They just decide, hey, I know it could be better than it is, but where I'm at now, it's not like all bad, and some parts of it are okay. And so they get comfortable staying in a place that's not where they were meant to be to start with. This morning, I want us to look at another ancient story that happened 3 centuries after Homer wrote the Odyssey that involves a guy named Nehemiah who doesn't do that. Even though he found himself living in a place that was extremely comfortable, he chooses to step out and do what God called him to do. Now, David Phillips actually preached on this passage a couple weeks ago, so if you want to hear kind of part 1 of this, you can go back a couple weeks on the website or on the app, and you can hear his introduction. But for today, I want us to focus on how Nehemiah moved from an extremely comfortable life to step out and risk to become the person that God created him to be and do the thing that God created him to do. So as Nehemiah chapter 1 opens, Nehemiah finds himself in the unique position of serving as a cupbearer to the king of Persia, a guy named Artaxerxes. Now, Nehemiah's primary job as the cupbearer was to sample the king's wine and taste the king's food. So that way, if anybody was like trying to poison the king would go unharmed. So in that sense, kind of a dangerous job, kind of an early version of the Secret Service. But there were a lot of perks that came with it. Again, part of his job is he drinks the king's wine and eats the king's food. Because of that, he was always around the king, and historians tell us it was not unusual for a cupbearer to become a trusted advisor to the king because they spent so much time together. At the same time, because he needed to be available 24/7 to the king, he lived rent-free in the king's palace, which was in one of the coolest cities in the ancient world, the city of Susa. And to make it even better, whenever the king decided to take a trip, guess who got to go with him? There's Nehemiah. So here's Nehemiah. He's in a powerful position. He lives in a palace like in one of the coolest cities in the world. He gets to eat the king's food, drink the king's wine, and if the king decides to take a trip, Nehemiah gets to ride shotgun. So you think about all the ways that people in the ancient world spent their lives, and you realize, man, Nehemiah's got it made. He's got the kind of job that once you get it, you do everything you can to hold on to it. The problem, though, is that he was not where he was supposed to be. And he was not doing what he'd been created to do. That's what makes it so dramatic in Nehemiah chapter 1. When he hears this disturbing report of what's happening back at home. And when I say home, I'm talking about his ancient sort of ancestral home. And he hears the news and it shatters his picture-perfect life and requires him to do something. Here's the way it starts in verse 1 of Nehemiah chapter 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. Now, for this to make any sense, you got to understand a little bit of the backstory. So throughout the Old Testament, you see this process. God is in the process of building this nation of people that will be his chosen people. We call them the Jewish nation. As part of that, he gave them an area of land that included the ancient city of Jerusalem. So I want you to see this on a map. And if you've been following the news, you know people are still fighting over these particular pieces of land. But what happened in this sense is they move into the land, things go really well for a really long time, and the Jewish people, just like we tend to do, they get a little too comfortable, they stop listening to God. So in order to get their attention, God allowed the Jewish people to be overtaken by the Babylonian Empire. They were led by a guy named King Nebuchadnezzar. And when that happened, it was 587 BC. So we're going to put this on a timeline just so this all makes sense. And as a part of that invasion, the Babylonians come in. They completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem, including the temple where everybody worshiped and the wall around the city. 70 years later, in 538 BC, the Babylonians are defeated by the Persian Empire, which was led by a guy named King Cyrus. And unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus didn't care about the Jews. So he said, those of you who survived or are still around, you can go back home and you can start the process of rebuilding not just your city, but your entire culture. It was a process that was going to take several decades to complete because, again, everything had been completely destroyed. Fast forward again, 458 BC, there's a guy named Ezra who's kind of a contemporary of Nehemiah, and he returns to Jerusalem. He's like the preacher of the bunch. So Nehemiah's a construction worker, Ezra's the preacher, and he shows back up and he begins trying to restore like the spiritual foundations of the people who have made it back to Jerusalem. And that's where we pick up the story in Nehemiah chapter 1. It's now been 13 years since Ezra went to Jerusalem. It's been 80 years since the people that Cyrus let go back have returned. And during that time, Nehemiah discovers that even after 80 years have passed, even after 13 years have passed since his contemporary went back, the walls around the city are still destroyed. But make sure you understand, it's not the walls that Nehemiah is mad about. The walls represent something bigger than just physical walls. Think about this. If you're trying to rebuild your city, if you're trying to rebuild your culture in the ancient world, one of the first things you would do would be to rebuild the walls because the walls represent a level of security. So another way to think about this is that broken walls represent a broken culture. They've not made much progress even after 8 decades. And so when Nehemiah hears that even after all this time has passed, the walls still haven't been repaired, he knows that means the people living there have done what a lot of us do, and that means they've settled for something less than what could be and what should be. Some of us can relate to that. Think about it like this. If I asked you, what is the biggest issue that complicates your life? My guess is that you would not name something new. Now you might. I mean, it could be. It could be something happened in the last week that just came in and totally blew your life apart. But the odds are much greater that whatever it is that complicates your life is something that you've been dealing with for a really long time. Toxic relationships, addictions, bad habits, family dysfunction, mental health issues, financial challenges. I mean, it could be anything. But for most people, and I bet that includes most people here, whatever it is, it's something that's bothered you for a really long time. You just haven't done anything about it. And as bad as it is, just like the people living in Jerusalem, you kind of got used to it. And so there's no real impetus to do anything. Somewhere along the line, either consciously or unconsciously, a lot of us have just kind of settled for something less than what could be. And that's where Nehemiah was when he was confronted with this news from home that required him to do something. It required him to take a step. As we work our way through this part of the story, there are 3 steps that he goes through that help him fulfill his purpose. They're the same 3 steps that we have to go through. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first one. You have to clearly identify the problem. And make sure you understand, I said the problem and not a problem, because there's a huge difference. Let's be honest. When it comes to identifying problems, a lot of us are experts at that, right? Like you can walk into any environment and in just a few minutes, you can identify a long list of problems that need to be corrected. It's really amazing when you think about it. Like for some of us, we can watch one 5-minute news segment. And when it's over, we know exactly what Congress should be doing. We can watch, be careful how I say this, we can watch one overtime basketball game and we know exactly what lineup Coach Cal should be playing. Right? We don't go to practice, but we know, right? Some of us, man, we can drive past a school on our way to somewhere else, and somehow we instinctively know what everybody who works in that school should be doing or should not be doing. It's amazing. We don't even stop, but somehow we know. That's just how it works. And Nehemiah had the same ability. I mean, you think, here's this guy, he lives and works with a king. He's got access to all the information. He's there every day as people bring all this information to the king, and the king has to make decisions. And I'm sure just like us, Nehemiah thought, I know exactly what you should do and how it should be done. But not every problem he heard about broke his heart. Not every problem he encountered left him breathless. And one of the things that makes this story so powerful is you get to verse 4 and you read about Nehemiah's response to a specific problem. Not just a problem, but the problem that broke his heart. Verse 4, it says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Let me ask you, when's the last time something broke your heart? When's the last time you were confronted with some issue, there was some problem, and your first thought was, you know what? Somebody needs to do something about that. When's the last time you had that moment? When's the last time you were so frustrated by something that you thought, unless something changes, unless somebody does something about this, I'm going to explode. Now I know, like in our sanitized church culture, we always like to pretend that frustration is a bad thing, but sometimes it's a really good thing because there are some things you should be frustrated with. There was an old German theologian, Jürgen Moltmann. He explained it like this. He said, faith, wherever it develops into hope, causes not rest but unrest, not patience but impatience. It does not calm the unquiet heart, but is itself this unquiet heart in man. Check out this line. Those who hope in Christ can no longer put up with reality as it is, but begin to suffer under it, to contradict it. Peace with God means conflict with the world, for the goad of the promised future stabs inexorably into the flesh of every unfulfilled present. Let me ask you, what's the last thing that broke your heart? What's the last thing that puts you in conflict with the world as it exists around you? For Nehemiah, it was the fact that these walls around the city that his family had loved for generations were broken. For you, it could be something else. Maybe it's a personal problem. Maybe there's something in your life, and you know that unless that thing changes, your life is never going to get any better. For some of you, it might be a community problem. You look around and maybe God has given you a vision of what life in our community could look like, and now He's waiting on you to take the next step. For a lot of people, it's an untapped ministry opportunity that you know somebody needs to tap into. Here in a few minutes, you're going to hear about a Celebrate Recovery group that we're starting, that we hope to partner with other groups to push back against this plague of addiction in our community. And I don't know what it is for you. I don't know. But I bet you know. I bet there's something already that bothers you, that frustrates you. The great writer Frederick Buechner said, "The place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." And while I don't know where that place might be for you or what that place might look like, I'm almost certain that you already have some idea of where it might be, because there's something that's bothered you for a really long time. There's something that's frustrated you for a long time. And as you look, you're uniquely positioned, you're uniquely gifted to do something about it in a way that would honor God and fulfill you. And then once you identify that thing, you have to go to the second step, and it's this: you begin to pray for an opportunity. When you get to verse 5, after hearing the devastating news about the condition of the walls, Nehemiah immediately launches into this prayer. I want you to listen to this with me. Verse 5. "Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps His covenant of love with those who love Him and keep His commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer. Your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to this prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." And then he adds sort of the postscript, "I was cupbearer to the king." Now, if you keep reading through Nehemiah, which I hope you do because it's such a good book, you're going to see that he prays over and over and over again. Almost every chapter includes some kind of prayer. And what's so cool about this is that at no point does Nehemiah ever ask God to rebuild the wall. He never says, "God, rebuild the wall." Instead, he says, "God, remember your promises. Remember what you told us. Remember Moses, and help us have success in our attempt." So on one hand, he could have prayed for a miracle. That's what most of us do. We're pretty good at praying. It's just that we pray for miracles that won't require us to do anything. That's just how it goes. And so we say things like, "God, I know our community has an addiction problem, and it would just be great if you would wipe all that out." Or we pray things like, "God, I know I'm completely out of shape, and it'd be awesome, when I wake up in the morning, if I'd be 6 inches taller and 50 pounds lighter." I mean, maybe that's just me, but wherever you are in that. "I know my family's a mess, God, but it'd just be great if tomorrow everybody just changed their mind and they agreed with me on everything and we could just, live happily ever after." I mean, that's the way most of us pray. We like to pray for miracles that won't require us to do anything. But what Nehemiah prayed for was an opportunity. That's different. And see, here's what happens. When you start praying for opportunities, you start to notice opportunities. It's one thing to have a dream. A dream is something that you would like to see happen that you know is probably not going to happen. So occasionally you might catch yourself thinking about it, but you don't invest too much in a dream. A vision is different. A vision is something that you see that you work toward making a reality. So one writer said it like this: dreamers think about how nice it would be for something to be done. Visionaries look for an opportunity to do something. There's a big difference. Nehemiah was a visionary, not a dreamer. He wasn't expecting God to do something independently of him. Instead, he was looking for an opportunity to partner with God to accomplish something that mattered, rather than praying for God to do something that he didn't need Nehemiah for to start with. And that brings us to the last step in this, and that's as you continue to pray for an opportunity, you have to plan for a better future. So here's what happens. Whenever you're attempting to fulfill your purpose, whenever you're trying to do something that you feel like God has called you to do, it never just happens. You don't drift into that. It requires a lot of careful planning. So for Nehemiah, there was a lot of work to be done. First, he had to go and convince the king to give him a leave of absence from his job. And then, because the king controlled all the money, he had to convince the king to finance the project. Then he had to get a letter from the king that would basically serve as a passport so he could travel the 900 miles from where he was in Susa to Jerusalem. And then once he had permission, he had to get all the supplies, draw up all the plans, organize all the workers, deal with all the opposition, and then later he even has to set up a government because the king appoints him as the governor of Judah. And if you know the rest of the story, as he does all of that, then you know that with the blessing of God, combined with his courageous leadership, Nehemiah was able to do in 52 days what had been undone for 150 years. It's an incredible story of an incredible accomplishment because one guy refused to settle for what was and instead helped the people accomplish something better than they could have ever imagined. There's one part of the story, though, I always wonder about. And maybe you can relate to this. I wonder, if any point during his life leading up to this, Nehemiah wondered, is this it? I wonder if there were ever moments where he just kind of felt stuck. You ever pray, God, hey, if this is all there is, it's fine. But there's a part of me that wonders, is there more to this? I mean, I wonder if he was anything like some of us, he had to have had those moments. And yet, when you look back over Nehemiah's life, it's incredible. When you know the rest of the story, you can see how really from the moment of his birth until the moment of his death, God was working behind the scenes to accomplish his will in Nehemiah's life. From the time Nehemiah was a little boy, God had been engineering his circumstances to ensure him a place among the palace servants. And then as he got older, God helped him climb that ladder until eventually he found himself in the position of serving as the cupbearer. And on the surface, it looked like, hey, he's just kind of building his career. But what you discover is instead of building his career, is that God was preparing him for his calling. One writer said it like this: like a master strategist, God had been working behind the scenes, putting all the players into position. And now the curtain was about to go up, signaling the beginning of a divinely scripted, perfectly cast play. All of a sudden, because he responded to God's call, Ephesians 2:10 became a reality in Nehemiah's life. And here's what I want you to know. What was true of his life is true of yours. Just like God was working to accomplish his will in Nehemiah's life, he's also working to accomplish his will in your life. And just like Nehemiah was designed for a specific role and a specific mission, you too have been created by God to do good works, which he prepared in advance for you to do. I have a picture I want to show you, one last picture. Back in 1998, there was an adventurer named Hal Roth who completed a kind of a unique project. He and his wife, Margaret, retraced the journey of Odysseus from the city of Troy, located in modern-day Turkey, across the eastern Mediterranean, to Ithaca, the island home of Odysseus and his men, located off the island of Greece. They later wrote about their experience in an article for the Smithsonian, which was expanded into a book titled "We Followed Odysseus." If you look at the map, you can kind of see the distance between where they started and where their destination between Troy and Ithaca was only 565 miles. Here's what that means. If Odysseus and his men in the story had traveled only 20 miles a day, which is pretty easy to do in a boat, they would have made it home in less than 30 days. And yet when you read the story, because of all the false starts and wrong turns and bad decisions, distractions, this journey that should have took them about 29 days actually took them 10 years. And in this project, this guy retraced the steps. Took he and his wife 2 years, but that's because they spent both winters at a resort town in Europe. And when you think about it, that's kind of a beautiful metaphor of how life works for most of us. Like, we catch this vision, here's what it could look like, here's what it could be like, and here's what you could accomplish, here's who you could become, here's what you could do. And then somewhere along the way, we start to take these wrong turns, right? And we get distracted by the wrong things, and if we're not careful, we wind up sort of spending the winter in a resort town instead of getting back in the boat, or maybe like Odysseus, we just sort of blow from one island to the next. And here's what happens. It's not long before a couple months turns into a couple years, and then a couple years turn into 5 years, and then 5 years turns into a decade, and then the decades start to like stack up on top of one another, and then you get to some point and you look back and you spent your whole life in a place you were never meant to be to start with. Another thing that's so interesting about the story of the Odyssey, I hope you go back and read it, is that when Odysseus left Troy, he had 600 men with him. 10 years later, by the time he finally arrives home, he's the only one who made it. 600 people started the journey. Only one guy ended the journey. But that's usually how it works, right? I mean, deep down inside, everybody has this vision. Everybody wants to live a life that matters. They want to fulfill their unique purpose. They want to be in a relationship with God. And yet the sad reality is very few people actually come close to doing it. And I think for most of us, the reason we don't is because we get too comfortable in a place that's not our home. And if that's where you find yourself this morning, I want to close with a quote from Book 2 of the Odyssey. Here's what Homer said. "But you, brave and adept, from this day on, there's hope that you will reach your goal. The journey that stirs you now is not far off." And it could be that you're not as far from home as you think you are. I want you to stand with me. We're going to have a moment of invitation. If you're here with me, you're here with us, and you need to take a step in a new direction, we'd love to help you do that. We're going to sing a couple final songs together. If you need to pray with somebody, you have questions about what any of this would look like, we will do our best to help you figure it out. Maybe you're here and you're ready to take this step of baptism or membership and become a part of our church family. We'd be honored to walk you through that. All you need to do is just meet us on one of these front rows.